when we discussed about the tension between globalist and localized, the not in my backyard movement and so on and so forth. So the kind of the proximity, as you, I think, as you described it, there is a bit of an elephant in the room in the sense that, of course, we are increasingly talking about, climate migration, and so which is already a very dear thematic for the far right. But at the same time, what you are saying is they are getting from a full spectrum denial to okay, we acknowledge the fact that climate change is happening, yet we don't like the policies that are being implemented. So how do we reconcile these two things? I mean, can you kind of draw a bit the picture about all these elements and connect the dots for us?
Yes, so it's very difficult to connect the dots because I believe the right and the left, for that matter, quite often has not reconciled or connected these dots themselves. First point that I would like to make when it comes to the relationship between far right and climate-induced migration, it's not as straightforward as you would expect, or as one would expect. When I started my research on these issues, as I said, some 7-8 years ago, I thought that this fear of climate migrants was going to be at the very core of the pro-environmental far-right narratives. So to sum things up, if a far-right organization was ever to be green, it would center most of its discourse around let's not have climate migrants arrive to our home country, because it was kind of a logical link. Far right was immigration was the central, the main topic of the far right, and you would expect that this is how they associate the environment, how they introduce the issue of environment into their broader political appeal. Surprisingly or unsurprisingly enough, I did not see much of that connection. The far right of today does not actually talk much about climate migrants as such. They are sometimes used as a kind of a weapon of, to be wielded to kind of instill fear. If we it is either the environmental elites that will kind of bring the climate migrants to our home country, or it is the fossil fuel industry. This is especially the case with the most extreme right, the eco-fascist organizations, which are small and irrelevant, who are kind of claiming that if we do not address the fossil fuel industry, we will be having ever more climate migrants in our country. As I said, this is not really happening, and I was quite surprised to see that wasn't happening. What is happening instead is, on the one hand, there is an attempt, and I'm talking now a bit more about the mainstream right, not necessarily the extreme. There is an attempt to capitalize on these issues, to kind of politically capitalize and economically capitalize on the issue of climate change. So, for instance, climate crisis, this is an excellent opportunity for us to become self-dependent energy-wise. A lot of countries have kind of strengthened this energy autarky discourse. Then again, we should also produce our own food more, grow local food, etc., etc. The far right has always been about this. In fact, there were examples in Hungary and in other countries, I believe, but in Hungary is the one that I recall and that I wrote about in my book, in which the far right and the far left were actually, not the far left, sorry, but the Green Party joined forces on the issue of small-scale agriculture. They were supporting it for completely different reasons, obviously, but the bill was actually the motivation was there. So for the right wing, it was more about the backbone of the nation, the blood and soil rhetoric. Every Hungarian should have his own plot of land, etc., etc. whereas for the Greens it was more about, you know, organic farming, etc. But it's interesting to see that sometimes these overlaps appear, and oftentimes in response to say outside factors. The pandemic was definitely one of them. It was indeed during the pandemic that a lot of far-right organizations were kind of advocating for growing your home, you know, your own food, which makes all kinds of sense. And there's nothing far-right about this, you know, in and of itself, but there was a tendency to give it give this far-right flavor. Now, there is a very, why I said there, it is very difficult to connect the dots, especially on the right, because there's this, on the one hand, there's this tendency to, climate change really is an elephant in the room in and of itself as a topic, because you either reject this altogether, but you're saying, yes, we think climate is not an issue that anyone should deal with, but we want to protect the environment. No single organization will say we're not for environmental protection. You know, even if you're a non-party actor, you still want to protect the environment. Obviously, everyone wants to do that. That's an example of a balance issue in politics. So there's this sentiment, and how, like, if you're anti-climate, if you're a climate denialist, how is it that you're going to frame your pro-environmental agenda? And that is very difficult. On the other hand, if you are acknowledging the existence of climate change, I think that gives you a lot more leverage to push for your own flavor, your own brand of environmentalism. And in that case, it is again more about, it is first and foremost about autarky and liberty, the idea of the nation being free to consume its own and to produce its own produced. But at the same time, there's another problem, which is the populist principle, people first. Because if the people are first, then you probably want to push for more imports, globalization. You cannot reject globalization if you're pro people, because that will definitely mean higher costs, you know, in the current things. So this is another issue that the kind of far-right ecologists around the world are trying to wrap their head around. And whenever they try to present an articulate program, it falls short on explaining on how is it that you actually deal with these types of problems. If we're talking about the left, not to be talking about the right too much now, if we're talking about the left, it seems like a very clear idea of how you know, climate change should be addressed. So it's a very clear anti-capitalist sentiment. Okay, tick. Point number two, we also want to scale down the production and the consumption. Okay, could be ticked relatively. But then again, what is the role of the state? You know, for eco-socialists, it's not the same as for the, you know, social ecologists or for the degrowthers. I'm not going to delve into these specific, you know, scholarly debates, but are we, you know, is degrowth really a solution? Are the small scale communities really a solution, or should we have a strong state, as you know, as it goes with usually with eco-socialists, that is going to kind of manage this green transition in the right way? Is the strong state our only hope against the corporations, against the elite? So there's a lack of clarity there as well. And I think that lack of clarity is ultimately contributing to these cracks, these little cracks that are unfortunately leading to some of the left environmentalist movements being recognized as extremist.